Welcome back to Advanced Photo Manipulation Movie Poster Effects. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we now find ourselves in Lesson 7. This lesson is the rundown of the mechanical parts. Now, this lesson will be a little bit different in style than the previous lessons because there will be no new techniques presented here. Simply, this is going to be more informative than it is instructive. The purpose of this lesson is to show you which photos I used with which technique to fill out the rest of the mechanical portions of the robot. I will say that it does take a considerable amount of time. The balance of the work you spend on this project will be in this portion of it here. Now, it's beneficial for you to do the work yourself and to be able to go through and find the different pieces that you think work within this robot. But if you want to know exactly what I used to create mine, that's what this lesson is for, is to show you which photos went where. So here we are with the leg piece that we finished off last lesson. And I've gone through and created all the rest of the pieces in the source file for this lesson. And what I'm going to do is go through and reveal each of them and talk about where the individual pieces came from and how they were assembled. So the first step after creating this leg was to create the foot. In this foot, the regular drawing mannequin as the base, and then photo 285 was clipped to it. You can see here what that photo is from. That's from this image here, where this back portion of the space shuttle was cut out and then placed in here and transformed to fit onto that foot. And then it was clipped to it. The lighting was then created just using another copy of that foot element set to overlay. So next was to create the other leg. And I created that using the exact same elements as the original leg that we worked on. The only difference is the direction, the placement of them, and also the cutouts of this leg. I thought it would be visually more interesting if I had a different pattern on those cutouts just to differentiate one leg from the other. But other than that, it's the same photos being used to create the mirror of the first leg. Now, I did not bother to do a foot on this leg because looking at the background elements, I figured the foot would be behind these trees and it wouldn't even be able to be seen. And I do plan on putting a lot of smoke and maybe some rubble effects down towards the base of this composition, so I didn't worry about creating the foot on that leg. So next was the lower portion of the torso and the midsection area. Now I used this file's number 0253 as the element to use for this lower torso area here, and also a fill-in of the mechanical piece from file 801. And you can see the elements here that I cut out both these wheels to add to the lower portion to sort of fill in the bottom part there. Now, the upper torso has some considerable complexity to it. So starting with the base torso shape, I've also got the file 801 available in which I cut out this interesting looking mechanical piece here, as well as 771, where I isolated this front panel of this steel plating here and then used Content Aware to remove the wooden log that's from this corner, so it's all a solid steel plating. And then using both of those elements together, created what I called the midsection plating. And then using that element as a basis, created a merged layer of that to start layering in to fill in the bottom portions of the robot's torso. And then it's clear that I also used some warping in there so that it would fit and sort of follow along the contours. Now also on the entire group for this upper torso, I created a mask for it so that I could go in and sort of carve out the small indentations of the elements, which gave it a much more realistic appearance because it looks like these mechanical elements are sitting on their own and they're not just wrapped around a smooth piece, which is how it appeared before. Okay, and then I did a very similar technique for what I called the midsection pieces, sort of the steel plating that folds in to create the undergirding of the chest plates. And I got the pieces here from file 0826. You can see it right along here, where I isolated and pulled that out and then started assembling them together to create this pattern of sort of a abdominal armor type of appearance. Then I layered that element in and created a copy of it to add the depth in a similar fashion to how we did it for the outer armor shells. Okay, and then this transition area here, I covered up with yet another piece from file 810. I thought it made for a pretty neat midsection piece to fold in there. Okay, so next I wanted to build in this arrangement of 3 fans right in the middle of his torso, created using file 350. So I simply selected this round propeller element, copied it in as a fan, and duplicated it a couple of times, and used the same technique to add some depth to it that we've seen used before. And then, of course, I painted in some shading elements there. And so then around the fans, we needed to have some chest plating. And for these elements, I wanted to have a nice crease right in the middle here that sort of simulates the look of pectoral muscles on a human. And this file, 0779, creates a really nice angle there. Now, I did need to use the content aware fill to remove the star and the numbers and this little latch hook area here. But that file brought in and then shaped using the pen tool to create this sort of pectoral armored shell appearance works really well in that location. And then a copy of it was made to create the depth, and then the back fill-in area was selected and painted on by hand. Then on top of that, we get the lighting overlay, which is really just another copy of that big torso shape, given an overlay blending mode, then hand masking out the areas that don't coincide with the actual mechanical portions of it. And then to enhance that lighting effect, I just made a copy of that, and that added a lot of intense contrast to that element. Okay, so now let's walk through the assembly for the right arm. I've got the basic model photograph right in there, and then the first shoulder joint is using a cutout from file 0379. Then the arm, the upper arm portion, is using a very familiar one. You should recognize that from working on the legs, and that is file 0381. Then there's the copy of the model piece to get the lighting in properly. The elbow joint comes from file 384, which is this back portion here, which needed a little bit of touch-up to remove the vertical piece, but then fit in really well as part of the elbow joint. The upper arm shell is also familiar because it comes from the same 351 file that we used before, also with the armor on the lower legs. And then those bolts within the arm come from that same shoulder piece, which is file 379 again. And then, of course, we have the lighting and the shading that was done likewise on the legs, just simply applied to the upper arm. Okay, so let's move on to the lower portion of that hand. That's the arm cannon, as I'm calling it. Now, I decided to use the main portion from file 375. And that's this one here. Used the entire piece because I thought this looked a lot like a big maybe plasma cannon that would be on the arm of a fighting robot. And then the inner nozzle of that gun is from the now very familiar file 351, which looks like it's the firing aspect of that gun there. Now, because we've sort of built up a separate element here that doesn't really match in with that first model piece, it was necessary to use a layer mask to restrict that piece in there. And now because I did that, what I had to do was create another lighting element in the shape of this arm cannon. And I simply did that by expanding one of the model arm pieces really large and then using the cannon outline as a selection to cut it out from that larger expanded piece. And that's how we have that base model element that fits this custom shape. Of course, the back rim had to be painted in, and then some hand shading there so it looks like the nozzle is sitting inside the gun housing. Some additional shading using the same techniques that we've used before. Okay, for this other arm, I created using the exact same pieces, using the exact same photos and the same techniques that were used on the upper portion of the first arm and the lower portion of the legs. Now for the hand, I expected this hand to be a mount for a big sword that would be used. And so file 403 is what I used here. Now I was able to select the back guard portions from this gray steel piece that this is bolted into. And that's what creates the hand guard looking elements here. The one that's in the back had to be created as a copy and then darkened using a levels command. And then there was also another copy created to add the depth to that rim in a similar way to the way we worked with the armor before. Now at this point in the design, I was really liking the way the metal pieces were looking, but I still felt the overall figure was kind of slim, looked almost thin and fragile, and I wanted it to have a little bit more bulk and heft to it. And I wasn't really happy with this lower torso area in the way that it appeared. So the solution I came upon then was to build a cod piece that sort of fits in around it. And that was a pretty simple solution using file 801. We've used this before. It's this cutout of this irregular, almost triangular looking piece, and then piece those together to create these three elements here that look like they're all bolted in. And of course I had to draw in the back portion of them and add some lighting of my own. Now the lighting for this is just a selection from a piece of the model. I believe this is actually from the bottom torso area. And that again, using that same technique, was set to overlay and then clipped to the basic shape. Okay, so now to approach the way the head was constructed. First of all, a texture was applied using that 780 metal texture plating here. We use that on the chest plate, but here it's being used to simply give some metallic appearance to that headpiece. I've got it set to luminosity and the opacity is reduced there. And then for the neck area, you can see in there, if I look in nice and close, that's clipped in there. And the neck comes from file 381. That's this one here. There's pieces in here that is just selected out and layered in for sort of some neck circuitry. Okay, now dealing with the eyes. You want to spend some time on doing this because it will be a focal point of the character. Anybody that ever looks at it will almost immediately look at the eyes of the robot. So you want to make sure these come out looking pretty good. I have them saved as a smart object in here because I wanted to assemble them separately in their own file, and I just brought them in as a smart object. Now I started with file 267, which is the front windows of the space shuttle, copied them across so that they would join into a single looking element here, and then I drew a shape to correspond with the inside of the windows, and the color of that shape is set to a nice deep green. But I set the blending mode to linear dodge and added some layer styles to it, including a gradient overlay and a satin using the blend mode of screen and again with a nice bright green effect. All right, so that's what gives us the eyes that are apparent here in the robot. And then this layer is simply a hand shaded area of it because the helmet ends up casting a little bit of shadow on those windows. All right, for the nose, I just saw file 386 and thought, doesn't that look like a robot nose? I thought so anyway. So I'm using it as that. That's just in there like that. Now, the rest of the helmet here was created using a copy of the base head element. That's this one down here, remember that? Copied that up and then created cutouts within it to make it look like the helmet is wrapped around the rest of the head, and then added that sort of rounded sphere shape to the top of it, again from the original photography. Then when all that was done, I created a merged copy on top and set it to overlay to give a nice lighting effect to the entire head, which also provides an appropriate backlighting for the helmet. Okay, we're almost done here. There's only a couple other things that I ended up adding at this stage, one of which was the shoulder armor, which was created using that same file 285. You're familiar with that? We've used that before. That's this one here, to me, which already looks almost like a giant robot's shoulder pad. So that was brought in, looking very similar to how it already looks. There was some warping and shaping done, and I also drew in the background rim to it here, painted a hand shadow underneath it, and then started working on the lighting effects, again using cutouts from the original model shape, which was just set to overlay and clipped to that photo piece. And that provides a really neat looking, almost battle scarred piece of armor element up there. And then the last piece put into place is this backplating. And that is from file 0820, which is this old mortar gun that has these nice big steel shielded plates on the side of it that I thought worked really well for those back elements of that robot. Now, you may have noticed that on a lot of these, there's already a path included there. I'm leaving these in with these JPEGs so that you can use them if you want, or you can create your own selections. But to use mine, you just go to the Paths panel, hold down Control or Command, and click on that path that's there, and that'll create the selection that I used to create my robot pieces. Now with this backplate, clearly you can't use the luminosity trick because there's nothing behind it to make it luminous too. You have to pull out that color information by either using a desaturate or the hue saturation adjustment and pulling the saturation all the way down, or I actually recommend the black and white adjustment. Also, with any of these pieces, as you're placing them in, you may find the lighting feels a little inconsistent, even with using the desaturation and luminosity trick. If you ever need to make adjustments to these individual pieces so that the lighting works, use just the levels or the curves command on those pieces to help them even out with the global lighting of the project. Now also, I've got this file saved in the source files. If you need to go through and pick apart my layers and see what went where, you're welcome to do so. But I do encourage you to do this hard work of going through and finding individual pieces within the photos that can be used as the mechanical assembled units of your giant robot. All right, guys, that's it for lesson 7. We've created the mechanical portions of our big fighting monster killing robot. Now, in order for him to be able to kill monsters, he's going to need some weapons. So that's our next lesson, lesson number 8. We'll give him some weaponry. See you then, guys.